The universe was old and full of voices, but on that night, only one voice mattered. It came from a world called Sonara Prime, a beautiful planet covered in crystal forests and glowing oceans, where a species known as the Velthari had lived for over 12,000 years, in peace and wonder and quiet study of the stars above them. The Velthari were not warriors, and they had never wanted to be warriors, and they had built their entire civilization around the idea that knowledge and healing and art were the highest things any living creature could reach for in this vast and lonely galaxy. Their bodies glowed with soft bioluminescent light that shifted color with their emotions, and when they were happy, the light was warm gold, and when they were afraid, it turned pale blue. And on this night, every single Velthari on the planet was glowing the coldest blue anyone had ever seen, because the Keth had come. The Keth Dominion was everything the Velthari were not, and they moved through the galaxy like a fire that could never be satisfied, and they consumed entire worlds and stripped them down to bare rock, and used the biological material of every living thing they found to feed their war machine and grow their armies and build more ships to go and find more worlds to devour. Over 3,000 Keth warships surrounded Sonara Prime in a ring of death, so thick that the stars themselves disappeared behind the wall of metal and weapons and hatred. High Matriarch Silen stood in the deepest chamber of the Temple of Voices, the most sacred place on her world, and she watched the tactical display with eyes that had seen 90 years of life and had never once looked upon anything as terrible as this. Her fleet was gone, and it had not even lasted 2 days against the Keth, and the burning wreckage of Velthari ships now orbited their own world like a funeral necklace made of fire and loss. 9 billion souls lived on Sonara Prime, and every single one of them was going to die, and Silen knew this with the kind of certainty that sits in your chest like a stone and makes it hard to breathe. Her advisor, a young male named Pale, whose light had gone almost completely dark with grief, approached her and said in a broken whisper that the Galactic Concord had received their emergency petition, and that the Great Assembly was voting on whether to intervene. Silen closed her eyes, because she already knew what the answer would be. The Galactic Concord was an alliance of 42 spacefaring species that had maintained peace among themselves for thousands of years, and they had laws and treaties and procedures and committees, and they were very good at talking about problems and very bad at actually doing anything about them. The elder races controlled everything, and the Draati, who were ancient and powerful, sat at the top, and they looked at every situation through the cold lens of strategic calculation, and they asked questions like, what do we gain, and what do we risk, and they never asked the only question that mattered, which was, what is right? The vote came back exactly as Silen had expected, and it was unanimous in its cowardice. Every single major species voted against intervention, and they used words like strategically inadvisable, and regrettable but necessary restraint, and we must consider the broader implications, and all of those words meant the same thing, which was that they were afraid, and they had decided that the lives of 9 billion Velthari were not worth the trouble. They offered refugee quotas instead, as if that were a kindness, as if telling someone, we will save a handful of your children while we watch the rest of you burn, was something to be proud of. Silen felt something break inside her then, not her hope, because that had died when the fleet fell, but something deeper, something like her faith in the idea that the galaxy was a place where anyone cared about anyone else. But she had one thing left, and it was the most desperate thing any leader had ever done in the recorded history of the Concord. She walked to the ancient transmitter at the heart of the temple, a device that could broadcast on every frequency known to every species in the galaxy. And she opened a channel not to any government, or any fleet, or any council, but to everyone, and to anyone, and to the empty, screaming void itself. and she spoke one word. She said it in Velthari, and then in Drothi, and then in Korvani, and then in Ilmathi, and then in every language the translator could find. One after another, over and over, a single word repeating on every frequency across every wavelength, filling the galaxy with the simplest and most powerful sound any living thing can make. Please. Just that one word, again and again. Please, please, please. A planet of 9 billion people begging the stars to send someone, anyone, anything. Most of the galaxy heard it, and most of the galaxy turned away, because that is what the galaxy did. It turned away. It always turned away. But on a small gray moon, orbiting a small blue planet in an unremarkable system on the outer edge of the spiral arm, a young communications officer named Lieutenant Priya Sharma was working the night shift at Lunar Station Bravo when her console lit up with a signal that made her hands go cold. She played it once, and then she played it again, and then she called her commanding officer and said, "Sir, you need to hear this right now." The signal reached Admiral Kaya Osei within the hour, and she stood in the command center of the United Terran Navy, surrounded by admirals and generals and strategists, and she played the message for all of them, and the room went completely silent. Humanity had been part of the galactic community for only 80 years, and in that time they had been laughed at and ignored, and classified as Tier 0 primitives, which was the galactic way of saying, you are nothing and you have nothing, and you matter to no one. The Terran fleet was small, just 114 ships, and the galaxy considered them toys, and their soldiers were considered barbarians, and their entire species was considered a temporary curiosity that would either evolve into something useful or destroy itself trying. One of the generals spoke first, and he said, "We are not part of this. This is not our war. We are not even invited to participate." Admiral Osei looked at him, and then she looked at the rest of them, and then she said 5 words that would change the history of the galaxy forever. "Since when did we wait?" Within 6 hours, every ship in the Terran Navy was moving, and every Marine was suiting up, and every pilot was climbing into a cockpit, and the entire military force of the human species was pointed at a star system most of them had never heard of, to fight for a people none of them had ever met. The Galactic Concord detected the movement and sent a formal diplomatic warning that said, "Intervention in the Sonara system is not sanctioned by the Assembly, and any unauthorized military action will be considered a violation of Concord law." Earth sent back a reply that was 4 words long. "We heard them ask." And that was enough, and that was everything, and the wolves began to run. The Keth Dominion had conquered over 200 worlds, and in all that time, across all those campaigns and all those burning skies, they had never once been surprised by anything. Until the day 114 human ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sonara system, and every single one of them was already firing. Warlord Dreth Khan stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Devourer of Suns, and he looked at the tactical display, and he saw the tiny cluster of new contacts, and he laughed, because he commanded over 3,000 warships, and these little creatures had brought barely 100, and he thought this was going to be the easiest kill of his career. He opened a broadcast channel to the incoming fleet, and his voice was deep and full of the casual cruelty that had made him the most feared commander in Keth history. And he said, "Little mammals, you are very far from your burrow. Turn around and run back to your tiny wet planet, or I will add your bones to the pile of the dead that already floats above this world." The response came from Admiral Kaya Osei, and her voice was calm and flat, and it carried no fear and no hesitation and no doubt whatsoever. And she said simply, "No." And then the wolves hit. The first thing the Keth noticed was that the human ships were not behaving the way ships were supposed to behave in galactic warfare, because galactic warfare had rules and traditions that had been followed for thousands of years, and everyone knew how battles were supposed to work. You lined up your fleets in formation, and you faced each other, and you fired broadsides, and the bigger fleet with the stronger shields won, and that was how it had always been done, and how it was supposed to always be done. Humans did not do this. Humans had never learned galactic battle doctrine, because nobody had ever bothered to teach them, because nobody thought they mattered, and so humans had developed their own way of fighting based on thousands of years of fighting each other on a single small planet where resources were scarce and survival was never guaranteed. And the way humans fought was terrifying. Admiral Osei ordered her fleet into what she called a wolf pack formation, and the 114 ships split into dozens of small groups of 3 to 5 vessels each, and they scattered across the battlefield like seeds thrown into the wind, and they came at the Keth fleet from every direction at once. The Keth ships were massive, some of them over 3 kilometers long, built to crush other large ships in head-on engagements. But the human ships were small and fast, and they darted between the Keth capital ships like insects around sleeping giants. And they did not aim for shields or armor or weapons. They aimed for engines and fuel lines and communication arrays and supply ships, because the humans understood something that the Keth had never had to learn, which was that you do not need to kill a giant if you can cut its tendons and starve it and blind it. The Keth had never encountered electronic warfare before, because jamming enemy communications was considered uncivilized by galactic standards, a dishonorable tactic that no respectable species would ever use. And so, when every Keth communication channel suddenly filled with static and noise and chaos, they had no idea what was happening, and their perfectly coordinated fleet became 3,000 ships that could not talk to each other. And then the boarding parties came. Terran Marines in heavy exoskeletal combat armor launched from the salt shuttles and latched onto the hulls of 3 Keth dreadnoughts simultaneously. And they cut through the outer plating with breaching charges, and they poured inside. The Keth had never been boarded, because no species in the history of the galaxy had ever been insane enough to try it. Security teams, and they did not have protocols for close-quarters combat inside their own ships, because they had never needed them, because the very idea was unthinkable. The humans did not care what was thinkable. Marine Sergeant Tomoko Ishida led her squad down the main corridor of the Keth dreadnought Bone Harvest, and they moved fast and brutal and efficient through hallways that were built for creatures twice their size, and they fought with rifles and grenades, and when the rifles ran dry, some of them fought with knives and fists and fury. The Keth soldiers were large and strong and covered in natural armor plating, but they were used to fighting at range on open battlefields, and they had no idea how to handle small, fast creatures that came at them in tight spaces with a kind of desperate, fearless aggression that seemed more like madness than military strategy. In the first hour of the battle, the Keth lost 140 ships. 40. Warlord Drethkon stopped laughing very quickly after that. He stood on his bridge, and he watched the tactical display, and he saw his ships burning and splitting apart and going dark, one after another. And he felt something he had not felt in over 30 years of conquest, and it took him a moment to recognize it, because it had been so long. It was fear. Down on the surface of Sonara Prime, deep in the underground temple, High Matriarch Silen sat in the dim glow of emergency lighting and listened to the reports coming in from what was left of her sensor network. And she did not understand what she was hearing. New contacts had appeared in orbit, and they were fighting the Keth, and they were small, and they were fast, and they were impossibly aggressive, and they were winning, actually winning, pushing back a force that outnumbered them 30-1. Her aide Pale rushed to her side with tears running down his face, and his bioluminescence blazing a color she had never seen before, a wild mix of gold and white that meant something beyond hope, something like awe. And he whispered, Matriarch, it is the humans. The humans came for us. Silene stared at him, because she had never spoken to a human in her life, and her people had voted along with everyone else to keep humanity classified as primitives. And she had sat in assembly meetings where human ambassadors were politely ignored. And she had never once thought about what kind of people they might actually be. And now they were dying in the sky above her world, dying for her people, dying for 9 billion strangers they had never met. And she pressed her hands against her face and wept in colors that the Velthari language did not have words for. Across the galaxy, the Concord watched through long-range sensor feeds, and the elder races who had voted to do nothing sat in their comfortable chambers and stared at their screens and saw the tiny human fleet tearing into the Keth Armada like something out of a nightmare. The Drothi ambassador, an ancient being who had seen 300 years of galactic politics, leaned forward in his seat, and his voice was barely a whisper when he said, "What are they?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew, because nobody had ever bothered to find out, because they had all assumed that a species so young and so small and so unimportant could not possibly be anything worth understanding. They were wrong. Back in the battle, Admiral Osei stood at the center of her command bridge as damage reports flooded in, and she had already lost 11 ships and over 2,000 people, and her jaw was tight, and her eyes were hard, but her voice never wavered as she gave order after order, and pushed her fleet deeper into the Keth formation. Dreth Khan ordered his fleet to regroup and reorganize, and he pulled his ships back from the planet to form a tighter defensive sphere, and for the first time in the history of the Keth Dominion, a Keth warlord was playing defense against a force a fraction of his size. Osei opened a channel to the planet below, and her signal cut through the jamming, because human communications officers were very good at their jobs. And her voice reached the underground temple where Silene sat among the last of her council. "Sonara Prime, this is Admiral Kaya Osei of the United Terran Navy," she said, and her voice was steady and warm, and carried the weight of a promise that she intended to keep with every breath left in her body. "Hold on, we are not leaving." And somewhere in the dark, a candle had been lit. 3 days into the battle, and the fire had not stopped, and the dying had not stopped, and Admiral Kaya Osei had not slept in over 50 hours, and the dark circles under her eyes looked like bruises, but her voice was still steady, and her mind was still sharp, and she was still standing, because the people below her on that burning world were still counting on her to stand. The first rush of adrenaline and shock was gone now, and what was left was the ugly, grinding truth of what war actually looked like when the glory faded and the numbers started climbing. 34 Terran warships destroyed in 72 hours, and each one of those ships had a crew, and each crew member had a name and a family and a life they would never go back to, and the list of the dead grew longer every hour, like a wound that would not close. The hospital ship TSS Mercy was the largest medical vessel in the Terran fleet, and it had been designed to handle the casualties of a small regional conflict. And now it was trying to handle the casualties of the biggest battle humanity had ever fought, and it was failing. Every corridor was lined with stretchers, and every operating room was full, and the medics worked 20-hour shifts, and then took 4 hours to sleep, and then got up and did it again. And some of them cried while they worked, and some of them had stopped crying because they had run out of tears. And the ones who had run out of tears scared the others the most. Captain Tomas Reyes commanded the destroyer Guadalajara, and he was 43 years old, and he had a daughter named Sophia, who was 9 and who had drawn a picture of his ship in crayon. And he kept that picture taped to the wall of his quarters, next to a photo of her smiling face with her 2 front teeth missing. On the 3rd day of the battle, Captain Reyes found himself alone in the path of a Keth carrier that had broken through the Terran line and was heading straight for Sonara Prime. And if it reached the planet, it would begin the surface bombardment that would end everything. His ship was damaged, and his weapons were nearly spent, and he had lost a third of his crew, and he knew with perfect clarity that there was only one way to stop that carrier. And he sat at his command chair, and he looked at the picture on the wall, and he said something very quietly that his bridge crew could not hear. Then he opened a channel to the fleet, and his voice was calm, and he said, "Guadalajara to Fleet Command, I am moving to intercept the carrier. It has been an honor." Admiral Osei heard his voice, and she knew what he meant, and she closed her eyes for just a moment, and whispered his name. Captain Reyes aimed his ship at the carrier's engine core, and pushed the engines to full, and the Guadalajara crossed the distance in 18 seconds, and the collision tore both ships apart in a flash of light that was visible from the planet's surface. His last transmission before impact was just one sentence: "Tell my daughter I did not look away." The Velthari sensors recorded the explosion, and they did not know what had happened, but they would learn later, and when they learned, they would weep, and they would remember his name for 1,000 years. This was what the galaxy could not understand about humans, and it was the thing that terrified them more than the weapons, or the tactics, or the electronic warfare. It was the fact that humans did not stop. Any other species in the Concorde would have retreated after losing a quarter of their fleet, because that was the rational thing to do. And galactic military doctrine said that any force that sustains 30% casualties is considered combat ineffective and should withdraw to preserve remaining assets. Humans did not follow galactic military doctrine. Humans took their losses, and they burned with grief and rage, and something else that no alien psychologist had ever been able to name. And instead of breaking, they got harder, and instead of retreating, they pushed forward, and instead of giving up, they found new ways to fight. They cannibalized their own damaged ships, stripping parts and weapons and armor plating and welding them onto surviving vessels, so that some ships looked like patchwork monsters held together with stubbornness and prayer. Pilots who had been awake for 2 days straight volunteered for the most dangerous missions, because they said they could sleep when it was over, and engineers rebuilt critical systems with improvised parts and solutions that violated every law of physics and engineering, but somehow worked anyway. Warlord Drethkon sent a private encrypted message to Keth High Command, and in that message he said something that no Keth warlord had ever said before. He said, "These creatures do not behave rationally, and they absorb losses that should destroy their fighting capability, and instead of weakening, they become more aggressive and more creative and more dangerous, and I am formally requesting reinforcements because I do not understand what I am fighting." Keth High Command denied his request because they could not admit to the rest of the galaxy or to themselves that a species classified as primitive was causing them any difficulty whatsoever. On the surface of Sonara Prime, the war had come to the ground. Terran Marines had established a beachhead near the largest Velthari city to create evacuation corridors for civilians. And they fought in the streets of an alien city, defending people they had never met against an enemy that outnumbered them in every way. Sergeant Amara Diallo was 26 years old, and she was from Dakar, and she had joined the Marines because she wanted to protect people. And now she was running through the burning streets of a city whose name she could not pronounce, carrying 2 Velthari children in her arms, while her squad laid down covering fire. Behind her, the children were small and fragile, and their skin glowed pale, terrified blue, and they clung to her armor with tiny fingers, and she held them tight against her chest, and she ran, and she did not stop running until she reached the evacuation point, and handed them to a medic who was already treating dozens of wounded aliens. A Velthari elder stood nearby, and watched this human woman, this creature from a species his people had dismissed as barbarians, bleeding from a wound on her arm and covered in dust and ash. Hand his grandchildren to safety, with hands that were shaking but gentle. He fell to his knees, and his light turned a color that meant something sacred, and he pressed his forehead to the ground in the direction of the human soldiers, and he stayed there for a very long time. Human combat medics began treating wounded Velthari alongside their own casualties, and they had never seen Velthari biology before, and they did not have the right equipment, and they did not have the right medicines, but they had field manuals, and they had their training, and they had the stubborn human refusal to let anyone die without a fight. Some of the treatments worked, and some did not, and some Velthari died on makeshift operating tables, while human medics tried everything they could think of, and when they lost a patient, they cried, and then they wiped their faces and moved to the next one. In the underground temple, Matriarch Silin requested a holographic communication link with the Terran fleet, and after some difficulty, the connection was made, and she found herself face to face with Admiral Osai for the first time. Osai looked exhausted, and there was blood on her uniform that was not hers, and her eyes were red, but she straightened up when she saw the matriarch, and she nodded in greeting. Silin looked at this human woman, and her voice trembled when she spoke, and she asked the question that had been burning inside her since the first Terran ship appeared in her sky. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this? You owe us nothing. We never acknowledged your people as equals. We ignored you. We dismissed you. We let the Concord call you primitives, and we said nothing. Why are you dying for us?" Osei was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Because you asked, and that is enough, and it has always been enough." Silene stared at her, and then slowly, with the kind of gravity that comes from 10,000 years of tradition, she bent forward in the deepest bow of her culture, a gesture reserved only for those the Velthari considered sacred, a gesture that had not been offered to an outsider in living memory. On the fourth day, Keth reinforcements arrived, 1,200 additional warships, and the darkness around Sonara Prime grew even deeper, and the odds became something beyond impossible. Admiral Osei looked at the tactical display, and her officers urged retreat. Stood there for a long time, and then she said, "Get me a channel to Earth, and tell them to send everything we have left." On Earth, the message arrived, and the President stood before the world and said 3 words: "They need us." And across the planet, something extraordinary began to happen, because cargo haulers and mining ships and colony transports and research vessels and every civilian ship that could fly and could carry a weapon or supplies or medicine began to volunteer, and people who had never held a gun said, "I can fly," and people who had never left their own solar system said, "Show me the way." The second wave launched from Earth, and it was not a military fleet, and it was not an armada, and it was just ordinary people who had decided that they could not sit still while others suffered, and the stars trembled at the sight of them. On the 6th day of the battle, the second wave arrived from Earth, and it was the strangest fleet the galaxy had ever seen. There were no matching hulls, and no uniform paint, and no military precision in the way they flew, because these were not warships, and they had never been warships. They were cargo haulers, with plasma cutters welded to their bows, and mining rigs with drilling lasers, repurposed as weapons, and colony transports with sheets of asteroid iron bolted over their hulls as makeshift armor. 219 civilian vessels crewed by teachers and engineers, and miners and farmers and students and retired soldiers and shopkeepers, and people who had been sitting in their homes watching the news feeds from Sonara Prime, and had felt something inside them crack open, and had stood up and said, "I cannot watch this anymore, I have to go." Jun Watanabe was 61 years old, and he had spent his entire life hauling freight between Earth and the asteroid belt in a ship called the Steady Wind, and he had never fired a weapon in his life, and he was afraid in a way he had never been afraid before. But he flew straight into the battle line anyway. When someone on the fleet channel asked him why he was there, he said, "I was a fisherman's son, and my father taught me one thing, and that one thing was that you do not leave people drowning, not ever, not for any reason." The Keth saw the new arrivals, and they were confused because their sensors told them these were not military vessels, and their commanders could not understand why civilians would fly into a battle zone. And the concept simply did not exist in Keth thinking, because the Keth did not have civilians, not really. Every Keth was part of the war machine, and the idea that someone would choose to fight without being ordered to was something their minds could not process. The civilian fleet should have been easy targets, and many of them were, and the losses were terrible in those first hours, as ships that were never built for combat faced warships that had been built for nothing else. But the humans kept coming. A mining ship called the Deep Vein swung its industrial plasma cutter in a wide arc, and sliced clean through the hull of a Keth frigate, because the cutter was designed to carve through solid asteroid rock, and Keth armor was not as strong as asteroid rock. A university research vessel called the Curious Mind deployed its deep space scanning array and fed real-time tactical data to the entire fleet, giving Admiral Ose a picture of the battlefield that was better than anything her military sensors could provide, because the research array had been built to map gravitational anomalies across light years, and tracking a few thousand warships was almost insultingly easy by comparison. Every time a civilian ship was destroyed and its crew died in the cold silence of space, something happened that the Keth did not expect. Instead of the fleet breaking and running away, 2 more ships seemed to push forward to fill the gap, as if the death of their friends made the survivors not weaker, but angrier and more determined. And the galaxy was watching. Long-range sensor feeds from the Sonara system were being broadcast across every Concord world, because the media networks had picked up the story and could not stop covering it, and billions of beings on dozens of planets sat in front of their screens and watched in real time as human beings died for strangers. They watched Captain Reyes ram his ship into a carrier, and they heard his last words, and mothers on alien worlds held their children tighter. They watched Sergeant Diallo carry Velthari children through fire, and soldiers on alien worlds who had been told to stand down felt shame burn in their chests. They watched Jun Watanabe, a 61-year-old freight hauler with no weapons training, fly his patched-together ship into the gap, left by a fallen destroyer, and hold the line for 11 minutes until help arrived, and ordinary people on alien worlds who had never thought of themselves as brave began to wonder what bravery actually meant. Something began to change across the Concord, and it started not in the halls of government, but in the streets, and in the homes, and in the hearts of people who had been told by their leaders that this was not their problem. On the Drothi homeworld, the largest and oldest civilization in the galaxy, and the one whose vote had led the decision to abandon the Velthari, the public feeds showed a split screen of the Drothi High Council sitting in their luxurious chamber, debating procedure and protocol, while on the other half of the screen, human ships burned and human people died. The protests started small, just a few hundred Drothi in the capital square, but within hours there were millions, and they carried signs, and they chanted, and the young ones especially were furious, because they had grown up being told that the Drothi were the most civilized species in the galaxy, and now they were watching the least civilized species in the galaxy show them what civilization actually looked like. On the Ilmathi homeworld, a species known for their medical expertise, thousands of doctors and healers walked to the doors of the military medical fleet that sat idle in orbit, and they demanded to be allowed to fly to Sonara Prime. And when the government said no, the doctors said, then we resign our commissions and go as civilians. The humans have shown us that you do not need permission to do what is right. On the Corvani homeworld, a warrior species that had been shamed by their own government's cowardice, entire military units threatened mutiny if they were not allowed to go and fight alongside the humans. And the Corvani generals looked at each other and realized that they could not stop this, even if they wanted to. Dam breaking, and one by one the governments of the Concord species began to crack, because the people would not let them hide anymore. High Elder Morvan of the Drothi was the most powerful individual in the galaxy, and he was over 300 years old, and he had guided galactic politics with a careful, calculating hand for longer than most species had been spacefaring. And he had voted to abandon the Velthari, because the numbers said it was the smart move. But now, he sat alone in his private chamber, and he watched the footage from Sonara Prime on a small screen, and he saw a clip of a human medic, a young woman with blood on her hands and exhaustion in their eyes, working to save a Velthari child whose body was failing. And the medic did not know the right treatment, and she was trying everything she could think of, and tears were running down her face as she worked. The child died, and the medic held its small glowing body and rocked it gently and said, "I am sorry. I am so sorry." And then she laid the child down and covered it with her own jacket and wiped her face and turned to the next patient. Morvan turned off the screen and sat in the dark for a long time. Then he stood and walked to the great assembly, and he stood before every representative of every species in the Concord, and he spoke, and his voice shook in a way that no one had ever heard before. Because Morvan's voice never shook. Morvan was the stone the galaxy leaned against, and now even the stone was trembling. He said, "For 10,000 years we have called ourselves civilized, and we built treaties, and we calculated risks, and we measured the cost of compassion, and found it too high. And then these humans, these creatures we called primitive, showed us what civilization actually means." He paused, and the assembly was so silent that you could hear the hum of the air systems. "It is not age," he said. "It is not power. It is not the number of stars you control. The treaties you have signed. It is the willingness to bleed for someone who cannot bleed for themselves. We are ashamed, and we are coming. The Drothi Grand Fleet, the most powerful military force in the entire galaxy, a fleet that had not been fully mobilized in over 3,000 years, began to move. And behind them came the Corvani and the Ilmathi and the Fenthal, who had not left their own system in centuries, and the Morvathi and the Selenun, and species that had never agreed on anything in their entire history, agreed on this one thing, which was that they could not sit still any longer. The combined fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel around Sonara Prime, and Admiral Ose, who had not slept in days, and whose fleet was barely holding together, looked at her tactical display and saw hundreds and then thousands of new contacts arriving from every direction, and for the first time in 6 days, her hands shook. The Allied fleet hit the Keth like a hammer, striking glass, and the Keth, who had built their entire empire on the assumption that no one would ever unite against them, discovered in the span of a single terrible hour that assumption was wrong. Warlord Drethkon stood on his bridge and watched red warning lights spread across his display like a disease, as his ships were surrounded and cut off and destroyed one after another, and his second-in-command approached him with a face that was pale and empty, and said, "Warlord, the entire galaxy is coming." Drethkon stared at the display, and his hands were still, and his voice was quiet and hollow when he whispered the words that would be recorded and remembered and repeated for centuries to come. Because the humans came first, and the siege of Sonara Prime began to break. When the last Keth warship surrendered, and the guns finally went silent over Sonara Prime, the quiet that followed was so deep and so heavy that it felt like the universe itself was holding its breath. Warlord Drethkon was taken from his bridge in restraints, and as he was led past a line of Terran Marines, he stopped and looked at them, these small creatures in their battered armor, with their exhausted eyes and their blood-stained hands, and he studied them the way a predator studies another predator that has beaten it, and he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The battle was over, but the cost was written in fire across the sky. 71 Terran warships had been destroyed out of the 114 that had come, and 143 civilian vessels were gone. The Steady Wind among them, Jun Watanabe among them, and over 40,000 human beings had died in the darkness above a world that was not their own. 1,000 people who had woken up on the morning they left Earth and eaten breakfast and checked their messages and said goodbye to the people they love and flown into the black, knowing that many of them would not come back. And they went anyway, because someone far away was screaming and they could not bear to do nothing. On the surface of Sonara Prime, the Velthari emerged from their underground shelters and looked up at a sky that was clear for the first time in weeks. And they saw the wreckage of the battle still drifting in orbit, a ring of broken ships from a dozen species, and they saw the Terran ships that remained, scarred and patched and barely holding together, still in formation, still on guard, still there. The fields outside the largest Velthari city were turned into a graveyard for the human dead, because there were too many to send home right away, and the Velthari asked permission to tend the graves, and the humans said yes, and the Velthari treated those graves with the same rituals and the same reverence and the same sacred care that they gave to their own honored dead. They planted crystal flowers at each marker, the kind that grew only in the most sacred Velthari gardens, and each flower glowed with a soft, warm light that pulsed slowly like a heartbeat. And at night, the field of graves looked like a field of stars that had fallen to the earth and decided to keep shining. Velthari children came to the graves every morning and left small offerings, stones, and drawings, and little woven tokens, because their parents had told them that these were the people who saved them, and the children did not fully understand what that meant, but they understood enough to know that these strangers mattered. Across the galaxy, the consequences of what had happened at Sonara Prime spread like ripples in water that would never stop moving. The Keth Dominion, which had held over 200 worlds in a grip of terror and hunger, found that its grip had been broken, not just militarily, but psychologically, because the subjugated species under Keth rule had watched the same feeds as everyone else, and they had seen what happened when someone was willing to stand up, and they had seen the Keth lose, and for the first time in generations, they believed that resistance was possible. Rebellions erupted across Keth space, one after another, world after world, and within months, the Dominion that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries fractured and splintered and collapsed from the inside like a building whose foundation had been made of fear and nothing else. The Galactic Concord was transformed in ways that no one could have predicted, and the first thing that changed was the tier system, the classification structure that ranked species either age and technology and power, and had placed humanity at the very bottom. The system was formally abolished in a unanimous vote, and in its place, the Concord adopted a new principle that was written into the foundational law of the galaxy, and it said, "No species shall be measured by the age of its stars, but by the depth of its compassion." And it was called the Terran Doctrine, and it would guide galactic civilization for the next 10,000 years. Humanity was offered a permanent seat on the Concord's High Council, the governing body of the galaxy, and the ceremony was held in the Great Assembly Hall, where every species was represented, and the hall was filled with beings who had once dismissed humans as irrelevant, and now stood in their presence with something that went beyond respect into something closer to reverence. Admiral Kaya Ose attended the ceremony in her dress uniform, and her face was thinner than it had been before the battle, and there were new lines around her eyes and a streak of white in her hair that had not been there 6 months ago. And she walked with the slight limp she had gotten when a hull breach nearly killed her. The fourth day. When she was asked to speak, she stood at the podium and looked out at the assembly, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "We do not want a seat at this table because we fought. We want a seat at this table so that no one ever has to fight alone again." The hall was silent, and then the applause began, and it did not stop for a very long time. On Sonara Prime, the Vilturi built a monument at the exact site where the first Terran Marines had landed, and it took their finest artists 3 years to complete, and it was made of bioluminescent crystal, the most sacred material in Velturi culture, shaped and grown with techniques that had been perfected over millennia. The monument was a towering sculpture of two hands reaching toward each other, one human and one Velturi, and their fingers were almost touching. And in the small gap between them, there was a light that never went out, a tiny star of energy that the Velturi engineers said would burn for 10,000 years. At the base of the monument, an inscription was carved in both Velturi script and English, and it said three simple sentences that carried the weight of everything that had happened and everything that it meant. They heard us, they came, they stayed. Every year on the anniversary of the battle, the Velturi performed a ceremony that had been created specifically for this occasion, because no existing ritual was sufficient to express what they felt. At sunset, every light on the planet was dimmed. Every lamp, and every screen, and every glowing crystal, and every bioluminescent garden, until Sonara Prime went dark, completely dark, a planet of 9 billion people sitting together in the darkness to remember what the darkness had felt like when the Keth came and no one answered. And then at the exact moment that corresponded to the time when the first Terran ship had dropped out of faster-than-light travel in their system, light on the planet reignited all at once, every single one, and Sonara Prime blazed like a star that had just been born, so bright that it was visible from neighboring systems, a whole world burning with gratitude and memory and love. Ships passing through nearby space would see it and ask what it was, and they would be told, "That is the Velturi remembering the day the humans came." And the travelers would go quiet and watch until the light faded, and they would carry that image with them for the rest of their lives. Years passed, and the galaxy changed, and new alliances formed, and old wounds healed, and the story of Sonara Prime became the story that every species told their children when they wanted to explain what it meant to be good. And one day, many years after the battle, an elderly matriarch Silen traveled to Earth for the first time in her life. She had been invited many times before, but she had always found reasons to delay, because she was afraid. Humans, but of the weight of what she felt for them, and she did not know if she could hold that weight in their presence without breaking apart. But she went because she owed them that much, and she owed them so much more than that. She arrived in a city called Geneva, and it was spring, and the trees were green and the air smelled like flowers and rain, and she walked through a park near the lake, and she moved slowly because she was old now, and her light was dimmer than it used to be, but it was still warm. She found a bench, and she sat down, and she watched the humans around her living their lives, walking their dogs, and reading books, and arguing about small things, and laughing at jokes she could not hear, and she saw children playing on the grass. She watched the children most of all, because children were why she had sent that signal all those years ago. Children were why she had begged the universe for help, because she could not bear the thought of the children of her world never getting to grow up. And here on this alien planet, the children of the species that had saved hers were running and tumbling and shrieking with laughter, and pulling each other's hair, and sharing snacks, and doing all the small, silly, beautiful things that children do when they are safe and free and do not know how precious that safety is. Silen wept, and her tears glowed softly as they fell, and her light shifted through colors that had no names in any language. A small human girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, with messy brown hair and dirt on her knees, noticed the strange glowing figure on the bench, and she walked over with the fearless curiosity that only very young children possess. And she looked up at Silen with wide, serious eyes and said, "Are you okay?" Silen looked down at this tiny creature, this child of the species that had crossed the stars for strangers, and she smiled, and her light turned the warmest gold it had been in years. And she said, "Yes, little one, I am okay. Because of your people, I am okay." The girl did not understand what that meant, because she was 5, and the galaxy was very large, and very complicated. But she could see that the glowing lady was sad, and her mother had taught her that when someone is sad, you should be kind to them. So she reached down and picked a small white flower from the grass, and held it up to Silen with both hands, and said, "Here, this is for you." Silen took the flower and held it in her palm, and looked at it. And it was just a small, simple, common flower. The kind that grew everywhere, and that most people walked past without noticing. But she held it like it was the most precious and valuable and important thing in the entire universe. Because she understood something in that moment that she had spent years trying to put into words. This was the answer to every question the galaxy had asked about humanity. This was why they were strong, although they were strong, and not because they were brave, although they were brave beyond any rational measure, and not because they wanted glory or power or recognition or a seat at anyone's table. They came because a little girl sees someone crying and picks a flower and offers it without hesitation and without calculation and without asking what she will get in return. They came because that is what humans do. They came because that is who humans are. Silen held the flower to her chest and closed her eyes, and her light filled the park with a warmth that made every person nearby stop and look and feel for just a moment that the world was a kinder place than they had thought. And far above them, the stars kept burning the way they always had, but somehow they seemed a little brighter than before, as if even the universe had learned something about what it means to answer when someone asks for help. The little girl smiled and ran back to play, and Silen sat on the bench, holding a small white flower and watching the children of Earth. And she whispered the words so softly that only the wind could hear them. This is why they came. And that was the truth of it. And that was enough. And it always had been.